The 2022 Candidates Tournament has ended, and this is one of the biggest tournaments of the year. I mean, it's the best 8 players aside from the world champion competing for 14 rounds. And so we obviously are going to get a huge showcase of brilliancies. And that's exactly what I explored in my last video. But surprisingly, there was also a lot of blunders. And a lot of people talked about how in the candidates, because of the pressure and high stakes, some of the best players perform their worst. And indeed, in the video today, we are going to explore some of the very shocking and crazy blunders that occurred, and it gives you an opportunity to play better than the players themselves. And so before each blunder that I show, I'll give you a chance to find a better improving move than what the Grandmaster played. So with that being said, subscribe for more content like this, and let's go ahead and jump into the first blunder. And it happened in this position, and this is a very interesting position between Caruana and Ding, and it happened later in the tournament, and the entire game in fact was worthy of analysis, but this position specifically I found super interesting, and indeed a couple of blunders happened here. So black is up a pawn, and because of the existence of the bishops and rooks, that does not guarantee a win for black, but there is a very specific way that black can go ahead in this position and convert the pawn advantage to a more sizable advantage and indeed win the position. And that was the specific way that Ding actually missed. And so here, Ding played the move rook d7. And although he went on to win because it's a very hard position to hold for white, it was objectively holdable here. And I'll show you that indeed Caruana blundered again and allowed the rook to infiltrate, and the game ended here because of resignation. This was a couple of moves ago because of this blunder, rook to d7 here. This was now a draw theoretically. There was a much cleaner way, a much more direct way to go about converting this position. And I'll give you a chance to try to find the improvement that Ding missed in this position, and we can go ahead and discuss it here now. What I find about this game and this position specifically super funny is that the move rook c3 was made with a very specific purpose, to stop bishop to d3. But bishop d3 is the winning move anyways, and I would think that Ding would at least consider it, of course, because the rook is tied down to this bishop. Now, first we should mention what happens if they just go to this exchange, because I think some people would fear this, fearing that the rook will get very active because it took first something like rook to d6, and then white will be able to make a pass pawn of their own. But this is not so scary. I mean, here we can continue by giving a check, eventually go f4, and now it's already quite difficult to play. I mean, we can go rook e2, forcing the king to the d file, where we could either give a check and of course trade into a winning position, or if it goes to d3, we can very simply just take the pawn. And now we have a 2-on-0, and I mean, even if they take this pawn, we can put the rook eventually on a2, and these two pawns by themselves can defend against the rook while this pawn cannot. So this is a theoretical win, and if you'd like, you can convince yourself of that, but that would have been a very simple thing to see. So the more difficult thing to see is what happens if they just move. I mean, what's the idea with bishop d3? Well, hopefully you found the correct plan of then going rook to e2 check. And the whole point, the whole premise of this position is whether or not black can get the rook to the second rank safely. Because the second the rook comes to the second rank, either the king has to go away and, as I mentioned, abandon the g2 pawn and allow these pawns to promote here, or the king has to stay something like this, let's say, and defend the pawn, but now it's susceptible to certain things like checkmate, and it's not really safe here on g1, and this could continue something like check. Here we can go check on f1, now we can go rook d1, very nice move, cutting the king, threatening f4, something like this, and if the king is forced back, there's mate, and if the king goes up, we can continue by giving check, the king goes up, and here simply taking the g2 pawn. Again, we forced the king to abandon the pawn, and now we can promote. So this was a very complicated endgame, and it had a lot of nuances, sure, but the general idea of getting the rook as quickly as possible to e2 should make sense, and this is the fastest path to do it, and it's a path that Ding ended up missing. Next up, we'll go to this game here. This was Radjabov with the white pieces against Nakamura, and unfortunately for all of the Hikaru fans, he blundered here, and this directly caused him to lose the game. There's a few ways for black to continue here. White does have an advantage regardless of what black does, but it's still a complicated middle game where there's counter chances with this king not being so safe, with these pawns being a little isolated and weak. So it's certainly not a finished game, but after Hikaru's next move, it becomes one. And Hikaru took the pawn on b4. Now the issue with this, and it maybe makes some sense, I mean, perhaps white was planning to take and win an extra pawn, although then the pawn structure would become fairly weak. So, you know, there's some thought to taking here, simplifying the position, getting rid of the two pawn weaknesses. But the issue is that now these two pawns are connected, and this pawn on c5 was previously some defender along the c file to the pawn avalanche that was coming down the queen side. Now it's a simple 2-on-1. Before, it was a more complicated 3-on-2, and typically if it's a situation where there's a pawn majority, you'd want to have more pawns on the board for both sides. So you prefer a 4 versus 3 than a 2 versus 1, and that's kind of the principle illustrated here. And you can see how now it becomes super straightforward. White simply pushes their pawn, continues to push their pawn, I mean, as much as it can go. Eventually, they get their rook active as well, and here the game finally ended in resignation. Of course, the knight super annoying, attacking a couple of pieces here, and if you take, then the rook makes its way to b8 pretty straightforward. I mean, king to c7, we go check, force the king back, and then go rook to b8, taking the rook next. If they try to go like this, we can very calmly take and promote, among several other winning moves as well. In general, we just got a situation where it's 1 versus 0, and as I mentioned, you'd prefer a 1 versus 0 if you're attacking versus a 4 versus 3, and this is why the pawn is just super strong and annoying, and there's no defenders in black's camp. The next major blunder happened between another Hikaru game, although this time he was in the better side of this mistake. It was Hikaru with the white pieces against Firouzja, and here Hikaru played the move c5, and he's trying to get a pawn that will be passed, of course, and if black allows it, defend it. I mean, b4 is the next move that will solidify this pawn chain and make this c5 pawn forever an annoying pawn that black has to watch out for. So, what would you play here with the black pieces? Firouzja blundered by going bishop to f8, trying to activate his bishop and go very directly, put some pressure on this c5 pawn, but perhaps he overlooked how strong it is once b4 happens, and now the pawn is again forever defended and always going to be an issue in black's camp. Much more important was to play a5, and this is what makes chess so beautiful. a5 might not make so much sense until you break it down like I just did. This pawn is a passed pawn, but it's less dangerous if it's targetable. The second b4 happens, it's game over. I mean, the pawn structure here is going to be too annoying for black to deal with once this pawn is defended, so a5 simply stops that. And now, you know, although white has a very minor advantage, the engine gives it around 0.2, that's nothing more than the starting advantage, and so this would have been a totally different ball game where this pawn could in fact become a target rather than a strength. And as I'll show, the game continuation was not so glamorous. Hikaru here gave away the exchange for the huge attack on this exposed king, and it was a pretty gorgeous attack. This beautiful maneuver of going rook a1 and then rook a3, bringing the rook in, bringing all of the forces, and in just a couple more moves, finally Firouzja threw in the towel, with the checkmate being super difficult to stop. In fact, here it's already a forced mate. The fourth big blunder that happened in the candidates happened in this position here. Again, Hikaru Nakamura, but once again, he's on the good side of the blunder. He's playing against Fabiano Caruana, and it was a very long, tiring game. It lasted a long time, and there were many opportunities for both sides, but this position specifically was super interesting. So the issue for black is that this a6 pawn is not sustainable. It will eventually fall, and then this b4 pawn will start running down the board. If you look at this e2 pawn, although it's strong, it's super close to promotion, it is incredibly well guarded. There is 4 pieces next to this pawn. The knight wants to come to g2, the bishop is already defending the promotion square, blocking it, the king is super close, so the pawn, although super strong, it doesn't seem like it can make progress. And that is exactly why white does have an advantage here. However, even with this big advantage for white, because of the relatively passive moves that Hikaru has played in the last couple of moves of this game, he gave Caruana a chance back into the game. And in this specific position, Fabiano had a way to get some counter-attacking chances of his own and churn the game into what looks to be more like a draw and a drawing territory. But he missed this chance, and now it's your chance to try to find the move that he missed. In the game, he played rook to f6, and although the rook is heading to f1, because of course knight takes would allow a promotion, the king moved, the rook goes to f1, white doesn't take. They very simply move the knight to defend the bishop, and now the rook can't do anything. There's no extra threat for the rook on f1, and the rook in fact just retreats to defend, but super passive. Now the bishop activates and cuts the rook's ability to see f1, so now both the knight and bishop are free because they're both defending, so one of them can try to do something in this game, and you'll see the game ended a couple moves later, and in this position finally Caruana resigned. He's losing another pawn, and in all of these moments the e1 square is super well defended. So going back, what was the chance that he missed? Well, in this position he had to go to h1. It's a similar purpose, but the big difference is from h1 it has an extra threat, and I'll show and highlight this threat. So knight to g2, same thing as before, defending the bishop, defending everything that black has seemingly threatened. However, now the rook comes to h3. When the king is out of squares on this g2 square, the rook cuts the king further, and if white is careless and takes a pawn, then g4 happens. And if white continues to be careless and tries to promote, now black is even winning with check and g3, and it's terribly difficult to stop this checkmates happening on f1. The engine shows you have to play knight f4 here to give this king extra breathing room. You just have to give away your knight. So that would have totally changed the path that this game took, but unfortunately Caruana didn't find this, and as I mentioned, he went on to lose the game. The moment you've all been waiting for, the biggest blunder in the Candidates Tournament 2022 happened in this position here between Radjabov with the white pieces and Report with the black ones. The engine gives a 5-point advantage for white. This is totally winning, but Radjabov didn't find it, and I think a lot of the reasons for this is psychological. I think the entire game didn't go in white's favor, and Radjabov was very happy, always thinking that he's worse. He was very happy to get a draw. I mean, even in this position, clearly he didn't think he's better, and he just wanted to end the game, and he saw a forced way to go to end the game. So very quickly, with just a couple minutes left, he played rook to f7. In fact, he played this move in less than 20 seconds over the board, which is nothing. And so clearly he was very happy to go for the draw, and that's exactly what ended up happening. Here they agreed to a draw, but white was totally winning. As I mentioned, 5-point advantage for white. What you'll notice, this rook is much more active than this one. This rook has the potential to be much more active than this one, and this bishop is also much better than its counterpart, and so white's pieces are simply better. This king is super exposed, and all you have to do is calm and coolly generate an attack. And so if you go rook f7, you're giving away your bishop, taking theirs, but now you're gonna have nothing more than a perpetual. You want to keep pieces on the board in order to attack, so you slide the bishop down to h2, where it's nicely defended, it can't be a target anymore, and you're going for the same idea of winning this bishop, but your bishop is safe, and there's nothing they can do. They can't really stop the rook from coming to f7. This is really good for white. There's no way to stop the rook from coming here. Let's say they play a random move, the rook infiltrates, it's game over. you're gonna lose the bishop, and then mate will follow. If you move the bishop, there's mate in 1. I mean, you know, you can analyze this position a little more deeply and see some of the other defensive resources black could try, you know, in this position or in this position, but you'll come to the consensus that, again, because every single white's piece is much better than their counterpart, there's nothing that black can do in this position. I mean, nothing can be done, and the game would easily have been won by Radjabov. So if you enjoyed this video and you want to see the flip side, the brilliancies, the beautiful concepts, the stunning and gorgeous ideas in the candidates tournament, then I'd urge you to check out my other video I made, very similar style to this one. For more videos in general like this, make sure you subscribe. Make sure you go ahead and also check out my chess website where you can see all of the cool projects that I'm working on. Like this video if you enjoyed it, and I will see all of you next time. Peace out.